The girl said nothing. She stood there. She knew that a prince would never choose her as a wife. She turned quietly and walked toward her small corner of the house, her heart heavy with emotions she could not even name. She had not expected them to be happy for her. She had not expected kindness. But even so, it still hurt. It hurt to be seen as worthless, to be spoken about like she was a mistake. She lay down on her thin mat, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, she had felt seen. For the first time, someone had looked at her and spoken to her with kindness. For the first time, she had been treated like a human. She closed her eyes and let out a deep breath. Maybe the prince would never ask for her again. Maybe today was just a moment of kindness that would never be repeated. But even if that was the case, even if this was the only kindness she ever received, she would hold on to it. She would hold on to it tightly, because for one single moment, she had been more than nothing. And that alone was enough to keep her heart beating for one more day. The morning sun rose gently over the palace. The prince, however, was already awake long before dawn, pacing back and forth in his chambers, his thoughts consumed by the girl. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over again. The way she had trembled when she stood before him. The way her lips had quivered as she spoke. The deep sorrow in her eyes when she talked about her parents. His heart clenched at the memory. She had been through so much, too much. And yet, she still found kindness in her heart to help someone she thought was a mere beggar. He knew then, without a doubt, that she was different. She was not like the others. She was not driven by greed or blinded by beauty. She had no expectations, no demands. She simply gave, even when she had nothing. And that was what made her beautiful. The prince took a deep breath and finally stopped pacing. He needed to speak to his mother. He needed to tell her everything. The queen sat in her royal chamber, dressed in a rich blue gown, her hands gracefully folded on her lap as she sipped her morning tea. The scent of fresh roses filled the air, but as soon as her son entered, she immediately sensed that something was on his mind. She set down her cup and smiled at him. "Godwin, my son, you look troubled." The prince exhaled heavily and took a seat beside her. "Mother, I need to talk to you about something important." The queen leaned in slightly, intrigued. "I'm listening." The prince hesitated for a moment, then gathered his courage. "It's about a girl." The queen's eyebrows lifted slightly. The prince nodded. "She is not like the others, mother. She is different. She has a kind heart." The queen's eyes softened. "Tell me about her." And so he did. He told his mother everything about how the girl lost her parents. How she survived alone and instead of her aunt to thank God, they labeled her a witch. How she was the only one cooking and serving everyone in the house. The queen listened carefully, not interrupting him once. Then, as he spoke about the cruelty she faced at the hands of her own family, the queen's expression changed. Her eyes darkened with sorrow, and her lips pressed into a thin line. When the prince was finished, he looked at his mother hesitantly. "Mother, what do you think?" The queen sighed deeply and shook her head. "My son, it breaks my heart to hear of the suffering this girl has endured. No child should be treated this way. No human should be treated this way." She reached out and placed a hand over his. "You have a good heart, Godwin. You see beyond beauty, beyond riches. You see the true value of a person, and I admire you for that." The prince swallowed hard. "Does this mean you approve?" The queen smiled, her eyes warm and filled with understanding. "Of course, I approve, my son." A rush of relief flooded the prince's chest. "But," the queen continued, her expression turning serious, "are you certain this is what you want? Choosing a wife is not just about love, Godwin. It is about responsibility. It is about choosing someone who will stand by your side, through every storm, through every battle. Do you truly believe she is strong enough to walk this path with you?" The prince did not hesitate. "Yes," he said firmly, "I believe in her. She has been through more hardships than I can imagine, yet she still found it in her heart to show kindness. She has endured suffering, yet she still has compassion. That is the kind of strength I need, mother. A woman with a heart that does not waver, no matter how hard life is." The queen stared at her son for a long moment, then she nodded in understanding. "Then she is the best choice," she said simply. The prince's heart swelled with happiness. His mother approved. His mother believed in the girl, even without meeting her, and that meant everything to him. As the day went on, the queen's words echoed in his mind. A woman with a heart that does not waver. Yes, that was exactly who she was. Now, he only needed to make sure she believed it too. Because from the way she carried herself, from the way she flinched at every harsh word, from the way she bowed her head as if she was unworthy of being looked at, he knew that she had been broken to many times. He needed to show her that she was more than the cruel words that had been thrown at her. He needed to show her that she was worthy, and that she was meant for more than a life of pain and suffering. The prince exhaled deeply as he stood by the palace window, looking out at the kingdom. This was only the beginning. He would find a way to bring her happiness. He would start by making sure she never had to shed another tear again. The palace was alive with excitement. Music filled the air, the soft hum of flutes blending with the deep rhythm of drums. The grand hall, decorated with golden drapes and magnificent chandeliers, sparkled under the glow of countless lanterns. Everywhere, noblemen and women stood in admiration, whispering amongst themselves about who the prince would choose. Many beautiful girls had come, each dressed in their finest attire. Their dresses shimmered under the lights, their jewelry clinking softly as they moved gracefully through the crowd. Their faces glowed with confidence. They had prepared for this moment for years. This was their chance and opportunity to become the future queen. But as they stood in eager anticipation, their eyes scanning the room for the prince, he was nowhere to be found. Then, the royal announcer stepped forward and called out, "His Royal Highness, Prince Godwin." The entire hall fell silent. All eyes turned to the grand staircase as the prince descended, dressed in a regal white and gold robe that trailed behind him. His crown gleamed atop his head, his expression unreadable as he moved gracefully through the hall. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He already knew his choice. He had known for a long time, but she was not here. The prince walked around the hall, his gaze sweeping over the eager faces of the girls before him. Some of them fluttered their eyelashes, some smiled confidently, and others adjusted their posture in hopes of catching his attention. But he barely looked at them. He kept walking, his face composed, his steps steady. Then he stopped. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Why was he standing still? What was he waiting for? The king and queen exchanged a knowing glance. The prince had told them beforehand what he intended to do. He had also given instructions to the guards and an older palace woman. And so, while the kingdom waited in suspense, the guards and the woman had already set out on an important mission. The girl, Kate, was kneeling by the backyard, scrubbing a piece of cloth on a stone. She had been left alone at home, as usual, given the endless tasks of washing, cooking, and cleaning. She had not even dared to dream of going to the palace today. Not when those that were born well were there. She knew she did not belong there. She was nothing but a servant in her own family's home. She did not own a single beautiful dress, nor did she have fine jewelry or elegant shoes. No one would even notice if she was missing from the crowd. She had seen how beautiful her cousin was when she was living. She told herself that she did not care, but deep inside, a small voice whispered that she did. She wished she could be there, not to be chosen, but simply to see the prince one last time. She sighed and dipped her hands back into the water, pushing away the painful thought. And that was when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, startled. The palace guards, a well-dressed older woman, and they were walking toward her. She froze, gripping the wet cloth in her hands. Had she done something wrong? Had her aunt reported her? Why were they here? Her heart pounded in her chest as they stopped in front of her. The guard spoke first. "The prince has sent for you." The girl's breath caught in her throat. "The prince?" She looked at them in confusion. "Emmy." The older woman stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Yes, my dear, you." The girl took a step back, shaking her head. "There must be a mistake. I can't go to the palace. I don't belong there. I am told not to leave the house today." The woman reached out and gently took her hand. "My child, the prince has chosen you and you must come with us." "Choose me? How? No way." The girl's eyes widened. No, this had to be a mistake. It was impossible, but the woman's warm, reassuring gaze told her otherwise. Tears welled in the girl's eyes. How could the prince choose her? And nobody, out of all the beautiful girls in the village. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she was wanted. The older woman cupped the girl's face in her hands and smiled. "Come, my dear. There is no time to waste." Kot led the woman inside. They went to a small table and set it up with delicate beauty products and fine fabrics. The girl sat hesitantly, unsure of what was happening, as the woman began to work on her. She gently brushed the girl's tangled hair, smoothing it out into soft, flowing waves. She carefully applied kohl around her eyes, bringing out the depth of her gaze. Then she picked up a royal gown, one of the finest dresses in the kingdom. It was a soft shade of gold, embroidered with delicate silver patterns. The fabric shimmered under the sunlight, as if it had been woven from the stars themselves. The girl hesitated. I can't wear that. The woman only smiled. Why not? The girl lowered her gaze. Because I am not worthy. The woman gently lifted her chin. Who told you that? The girl opened her mouth, but no words came, because she knew the answer. Her aunt, her cousin, the people who had looked down on her all her life. The woman's eyes softened. Do not let their words define you, my child. You are more than what they say now. Let's get you dressed. Minutes later, the girl stood before a large mirror. She gasped. She barely recognized herself. The rags were gone. The dirt and bruises that had covered her skin were no longer visible. She looked beautiful. Tears filled her eyes. She had never felt beautiful before. The woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You were always beautiful, she whispered. You just never saw it. The girl turned to her, overwhelmed. Thank you. The woman smiled and wiped the tears from the girl's cheeks. Come now, my dear. The prince is waiting. Back in the palace, the tension grew thicker as the prince remained still. Everyone in the hall stared at him, whispering in confusion. What was he waiting for? Why wasn't he making his choice? Then, the grand doors slowly swung open, and the entire hall fell into silence. All eyes turned toward the entrance, and there she stood, dressed in gold, her hair cascading down her shoulders, her eyes shining with a newfound confidence. For the first time in her life, she did not lower her gaze. She stood tall, her heart beating wildly in her chest as she stepped forward. The prince turned toward her. A slow smile spread across his lips. He had found her. He had finally found her. And nothing in the world would take her away from him again. Kate's aunt exchanged a stunned glance with her own daughter. Both wondered silently if this radiant, transformed figure was truly the same girl they had left behind, a girl who, only hours before, had been confined to chores and scolded for daring to step beyond her prescribed limits. Their hearts trembled with the mingling of hope, fear, and the sharp sting of guilt. Kate's aunt couldn't take it. The face behind the beautiful dress looked like Kate, but how? Who dashed monkey bananas? Is that not Kate? Kate's aunt asked her daughter. Mom, I don't know again. She can't be Kate, perhaps someone that looks like her. The girl replied and her mother nodded. It must be someone that looked like Kate. She can't be Kate, she told herself and stared at the beautiful girl. Prince Godwin moved with quiet determination toward the newly arrived maiden. Every step he took exuded a mixture of regal authority and tender affection. The prince's eyes, deep with unspoken emotion, locked onto hers as he reached her side. Without fanfare or grandiloquent proclamations, he took her hand gently and escorted her to the center of the room. In that moment, as the entire crowd watched in rapt silence, he presented her as his bride. Kate's cousin and other maidens burst into sobs. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. The girl, overcome with a shock so profound it silenced her heart, could scarcely believe what was unfolding before her eyes. Her breath hitched as she looked up into the eyes of the man who had once seen her in a state of unimaginable humility. Then, in a voice that resonated with both vulnerability and resolve, Prince Godwin began to speak. His words, carefully chosen and laced with heartfelt emotion, swept over the crowd like a clarion call for justice. My people and esteemed guests, he began, his tone both solemn and sincere. I stand before you not merely as your crown prince, but as the very man who, on a dark and stormy night, was reduced to a beggar, humble and forgotten. On that night, when the world had turned its back on me, there was but one soul who reached out with kindness and compassion. The hall fell into an even deeper hush as his gaze drifted to the beautiful girl at his side. That soul, he declared, was this very maiden. When all others shunned me, when I was chased away and beaten by harsh words and cruelty, she alone offered me food and warmth. She, despite the hardships and the scorn imposed upon her by those who should have cared, showed me that true beauty lies not in riches or appearances, but in the purity of one's heart. It was then that Kate's aunt noticed that the girl in that beautiful dress was Kate, her own Kate, the girl she had called evil, the one she had referred to as a witch. She is now about to be a queen. As his voice rang out, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of his revelation. The prince recounted every painful detail, the harsh beating, the bitter curses, the cruel dismissal that had been inflicted upon her by those who would have kept her hidden away, unworthy of recognition. His words painted a picture of suffering and injustice, yet they were interlaced with the radiant hope that had grown within him since that fateful night. The crowd listened, spellbound, as murmurs of shock and sympathy began to ripple through the assembly. Eyes that had once been filled with admiration for polished beauty now shimmered with empathy. for a soul so scared yet resilient. For many, it was a moment of awakening, a realization that the trappings of nobility and elegance could never compare to the strength of a compassionate spirit. Standing there, beneath the glittering lights and the watchful gaze of history itself, the prince's declaration was not merely an announcement of his choice. It was a testament to a belief in redemption, in the power of kindness, and in the transformative strength of genuine love. His quiet, steadfast resolve had turned a night of heartache into one of hope and honor. The beautiful girl, still trembling from the overwhelming surge of emotions, felt tears of gratitude and disbelief well in her eyes. In that breathtaking moment, as the prince embraced her and introduced her again to the world as his bride, she began to understand that she was seen not for what she had been forced to endure, but for who she truly was. And in that profound recognition, the path to a future filled with compassion, justice, and true love unfurled before them both. The echo of the prince's words still resonate in the grand hall where centuries of pomp and ceremony had witnessed many choices, but none quite like this. For a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate as every guest, noble and commoner alike, grappled with the stunning truth that had been laid bare. The crown prince, the very man destined to inherit the kingdom, had once been nothing more than a beggar on a stormy night, and the girl before him, this radiant, unassuming maiden in a regal gown, was the only one who had offered him kindness when all others had turned away. A hushed murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Eyes that had earlier been filled with the expectation of witnessing a traditional coronation now shimmered with shock and empathy. Some noblemen exchanged glances of quiet disapproval, their finely wrought masks of pride cracking ever so slightly, while others bowed their heads, overcome with a sense of profound sorrow for the hardships endured by the girl. It was as if the entire assembly had been unmoored from its accustomed notions of beauty and worth, forced instead to confront the true nature of compassion and humanity. At the center of this emotional tempest stood Prince Godwin, his eyes never leaving his bride's face. In his steady gaze lay not just a declaration of love, but a vow of protection and a promise of transformation, not merely for the girl, but for the entire kingdom. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of that promise as he continued, "I stand here before you to remind you all that true nobility is measured not by the shimmer of silk or the sparkle of jewels, but by the kindness we extend to those in need. Today, I honor that truth, and I honor her." For Kate, who had spent her life confined to shadows both by circumstance and by the cruel words of those who had forsaken her, each syllable of the prince's declaration was a balm to old wounds. Still trembling, she could scarcely believe that her quiet, hidden existence had become the focal point of the kingdom's attention. In the mirror earlier that day, she had scarcely recognized the woman who now stood before a crowd of thousands. Her reflection showed not a mere servant, nor a downtrodden girl forced into the margins of society, but someone reborn, a woman whose beauty shone from within, illuminated by a newfound confidence and a glimmer of hope. In the moments after the prince's revelation, the hall transformed from a theater of tradition into a living testament to the power of mercy and resilience. Whispers began to rise among the onlookers, a tapestry of voices each retelling in hushed tones the story of that fateful, stormy night, the cruelty of those who beat and cursed her, the heart-wrenching injustice inflicted upon a soul that had only known hardship. For many, it was a moment of reckoning, a realization that the kingdom's elite had long been blinded by shallow criteria, missing the very essence of what it meant to be truly human. A distinguished noble woman in the front row, her face etched with lines of regret and sorrow, finally spoke out, her voice trembling with both indignation and compassion. "How can we stand by and allow such cruelty to persist?" she demanded softly, as if questioning not just the act, but the very nature of injustice. Her words, though few, struck a chord with many in the assembly, igniting a wave of empathy that began to sweep away the arrogance that had long held sway. Amid the rising tide of emotion, the girl, now the bride, felt a whirlwind of conflicting sensations. There was fear, certainly, the fear of stepping into an unknown future, of confronting a past marred by neglect and abuse. Yet, layered beneath that fear was a tender hope, a fragile yet persistent spark that promised a life where she might finally be seen for who she truly was. Her eyes glistened with inched tears, and her hands, once trembling with uncertainty, now grasped the prince's with a quiet resolve. Prince Godwin leaned in closer, his voice a gentle murmur meant only for her. "I promise you, no longer will you suffer in silence. Your past does not define you, and from this day forth, you shall know kindness, respect, and love beyond measure." His words, tender and sincere, wrapped around her like a warm embrace, dispelling the lingering shadows of her former life. In that moment, as the royal couple stood united beneath the soaring arches of the hall, a palpable shift took place. The oppressive weight of the old order began to give way to a new dawn where compassion would be valued above all, where the measure of a person's worth was determined by the light in their heart rather than the gleam of their appearance. Outside the grand hall, in corridors and private chambers alike, news of the prince's decision spread like wildfire. Families who had once scoffed at the girl now found themselves grappling with an overwhelming sense of shame and regret. The woman who had once cared for her, whose eyes had widened in disbelief at the sight of her transformed self, clutched her hands together and whispered prayers of gratitude for the change that was sweeping through the palace. Meanwhile, those who had once assumed that the crown would rest upon the head of a perfectly sculpted beauty now began to question the values upon which their society had been built. As the ceremony drew to a close and the jubilant strains of music filled the air, the prince and his bride stepped onto the palace balcony. Before a sea of adoring faces, they shared a quiet, intimate moment, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been overcome, and all that lay ahead. The night sky, studded with countless stars, bore witness to this union of hearts and souls, a union that transcended the superficial and reached deep into the very essence of what it meant to be alive. In that luminous glow, the girl once shunned and condemned found herself wrapped in a future replete with promise, and for Prince Godwin, the journey from the depths of despair to the heights of honor had only just begun. Together, they would lead the kingdom into an era where compassion reigned supreme, where every soul, regardless of its origin, was celebrated for the goodness within. Thus, in the resplendent halls of the palace, amid tears of joy and whispers of change, a new chapter in the kingdom's history was written, a chapter defined not by the glimmer of gold or the sparkle of jewels, but by the enduring, transformative power of love. The palace was never the same again. The echoes of that fateful coronation day rippled through the kingdom, changing the very fabric of society. No longer were people judged solely by beauty or wealth. The prince's choice, his firm stand for love and compassion, had shifted the hearts of many. The girl, now Princess Kate, still struggled to believe the life she now lived. Every morning, she woke up expecting to hear her aunt's voice screaming at her, demanding chores. But instead, she was met with warmth, with servants bowing to her, with Prince Godwin's gentle voice asking how she had slept. At first, she felt like an imposter in her own life. She had spent too many years being told she was worthless, too many days being beaten down, both physically and emotionally. Could it truly be real, that she was loved, that she was valued? But as the days passed, she realized this was real. The prince never wavered in his affection for her. He treated her like a queen even before the official wedding. He sat with her, listened to her, reassured her when she struggled with self-doubt. He encouraged her to speak her mind, to dream, to embrace the power that now lay within her grasp. The people of the kingdom, too, embraced her. The commoners, who once feared the nobles, found hope in the kindness of their new princess. She walked among them, spoke to them, listened to their struggles. She used her influence to change lives, to bring comfort to the suffering. Her aunt and cousin, however, could not believe what had happened. The shame of seeing the very girl they had mistreated rise above them was unbearable. They tried to send messages to the palace, pretending to have loved Kate all along, but the prince was not fooled. He made it clear that they would not be welcomed unless Kate chose to forgive them. For a long time, Kate was hesitant. The wounds were deep. But in time, she found it in her heart to forgive, not for their sake, but for hers. She did not want to carry bitterness in her new life. However, she made one thing clear: she would never go back to being mistreated. Her aunt and cousin, now shunned by the very people who once stood by their cruelty, were left to reflect on their mistakes. The wedding between Prince Godwin and Princess Kate was the most magnificent the kingdom had ever seen. Nobles and commoners alike celebrated, and for the first time, the divide between the rich and the poor seemed less impossible to bridge. The streets were filled with laughter, music, and lights that sparkled like the stars. Dressed in an elegant gown of silver and gold, Kate walked down the aisle, her heart pounding with emotion. This was not just a wedding, it was her rebirth. No longer the girl who cowered in the shadows, she stood tall beside the man who had seen her worth when no one else did. When the prince placed the crown upon her head, the crowd erupted in joy. And as they sealed their vows with a kiss, a new era began. An era of love, kindness, and second chances. An era where beauty was no longer just skin deep. Hello champions, I hope you enjoyed our stories. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.